The time it happened, almost no one at the 7th Precinct could believe it. An officer who'd built a quiet reputation for racial profiling ended up face-to-face with the one man he never should have crossed. What went down that morning didn't just shake the department. It lit a fire under a city already simmering with tension. It started like any other routine patrol, but by sundown, that routine would be anything but. The arrest made headlines. The mugshot never got released. And by the time the officer learned the truth, it was already too late. Officer Bradley Kirkland wasn't new to patrols. In fact, he prided himself on being a by-the-book enforcer, even though his version of the book always seemed to have fewer pages when it came to black men. He'd never been officially reprimanded. Internal Affairs had a stack of complaints, but nothing ever stuck. One of those officers who knew how to keep things just on the right side of dirty, he'd been quietly running his corner of the city with intimidation, smugness, and unchecked power for nearly 9 years. March 3rd was supposed to be another one of those days. It was just after 7:45 a.m. when he spotted a dark gray SUV parked outside a small cafe on Franklin Street. The vehicle had out-of-state plates, Massachusetts, clean registration, but inside sat a tall, sharply dressed black man sipping coffee from a to-go cup, scrolling through his phone. That was all it took. Bradley flipped on his lights and pulled up aggressively behind the vehicle, getting out before dispatch could even respond to his location ping. The man in the SUV looked up, calm, maybe even a little amused, but not nervous. Not like Bradley expected. The exchange that followed wasn't recorded on any body cam. Bradley claimed his was malfunctioning. Witnesses said otherwise. What they saw was a heated confrontation. Bradley demanding ID without explanation. The man refusing, then calmly stating he hadn't broken any laws. Bradley escalating. The man finally stating that he had business with the precinct and would comply once Bradley gave a lawful reason. But Bradley didn't back down. He reached in, opened the door, dragged the man out, and cuffed him face down on the pavement. No resistance, no threat, just dignity, until it was stripped from him. Back at the precinct, booking didn't go as smoothly as usual. First red flag, when Officer Jenna Miles saw the man brought in, her eyes widened. She whispered something to the front desk clerk, who froze mid-keystroke. But Bradley pushed past them, slapping down paperwork. Refused to identify, resisting, suspicious behavior. Nobody said a word. The man stood there in silence, his tailored navy blue suit slightly dirtied from the pavement, the scuff of his Italian shoes catching the fluorescent light. He didn't look like a criminal. He didn't look like someone who belonged in a holding cell. He looked like someone who owned the room. That's when Captain Harold Voss walked in, 30 years on the force, eyes like steel, and no patience for surprises. He looked at the man, then at Bradley, then back again, and his entire posture changed. "What the hell did you just do?" he asked, not loudly, but with a weight that made every officer in the room stop breathing. Bradley, now sweating, shrugged. "Refused to identify. I followed protocol." Voss stared at him. "You didn't ask who he was, did you?" Bradley opened his mouth, but the captain cut him off. "You just arrested the new chief of police." Silence hit like a hammer. Bradley blinked, then scoffed. "No, that can't be. This guy? No badge, no ID, nothing." Voss turned to the man, who calmly reached into his pocket and produced a wallet. Inside was a Department of Justice clearance card, a temporary credentials pass for the city of Millstone, and a folded letter signed by the mayor himself. The man extended it to Voss, who read it, eyes scanning quickly. Then Voss looked back at Bradley, pure disgust hardening in his expression. "You just put handcuffs on Chief Elias Monroe." For a moment, Bradley felt like the ground dropped out beneath him. Elias Monroe. The name had been floated weeks ago. Rumors of a departmental shakeup, of a new chief from out of state, someone with a federal background. someone progressive. The department grapevine called it overkill, said Millstone didn't need an outsider poking around. Bradley had laughed it off, and now here he was, standing in front of the man he'd profiled, cuffed, humiliated, and who now held the fate of every officer in this room in his hands. But Chief Monroe didn't rage. He didn't demand an apology. He just looked at Bradley with a chilling kind of calm. "Uncuff me," he said. Miles rushed forward and did just that. Monroe adjusted his sleeve, dusted off his coat, and then faced the room. "I'll be taking my office upstairs shortly. I'd like a full copy of today's shift reports. And someone tell maintenance to get the body cam footage off backup since Officer Kirkland's device mysteriously failed." He walked out without another word. Bradley stood frozen. The silence was suffocating. No one made eye contact. Voss finally leaned in close and muttered, "You better lawyer up." The internal investigation launched within the hour. Every past complaint Bradley ever had was pulled and re-reviewed. Civil rights attorneys started circling. The mayor released a public statement by noon calling the incident deeply troubling and expressing full confidence in Chief Monroe's ability to reform the department. By nightfall, 3 more officers had come forward to report similar behavior by Bradley. 2 had covered for him. 1 admitted they were scared of retaliation. But that wasn't even the real twist. The twist came 3 days later when a quiet file was delivered to the chief's desk, an unmarked envelope that arrived via internal courier with no return label. Inside were printed emails, dozens of them, all between Officer Bradley Kirkland and someone named L. Sloan. The emails were old, some dating back over a year. Most looked routine, shift changes, minor complaints. But a few contained something far darker. Coded language, time-stamped traffic stops, arrest logs that mysteriously aligned with drops in neighborhood property values, data manipulation, targeted patrol zones, and attached to the final email, 1 photo. A grainy image of Chief Monroe taken at an airport months before he arrived in Millstone. The caption, "He's coming. Watch your 6." Chief Monroe stared at that photo for a long time. Then he picked up the phone. "Get me the state attorney's office," he said, "and tell them I have evidence of a conspiracy inside Millstone PD." Because now it wasn't just about a racist cop who made a bad call. Now it was about who had been watching the new chief long before he ever put on the badge, who had been warning others, who knew he was coming and wanted him stopped. And the scariest part? Officer Kirkland wasn't acting alone. As the city braced for fallout and the walls of the department started to tremble, Monroe stared out his office window, jaw tight. The trap had been deeper than he thought, but he hadn't walked into it by accident. He walked in with eyes wide open. Because Chief Monroe wasn't just here to clean house. He was here to burn the rot to the ground. The days that followed the arrest sent ripples through the entire Millstone Police Department. But for Chief Elias Monroe, there was no time to bask in vindication. He hadn't come to Millstone looking for petty revenge. He came because he already knew what was here. The email file confirmed it. Someone had been watching him long before he ever set foot in that precinct. Someone had been tipped off about his appointment, and Officer Bradley Kirkland wasn't just some rogue cop on a power trip. He was a pawn in a much older, deeper network. That photo taken at the airport was the final piece of proof. Someone had eyes on him, someone inside the system. And Monroe was now sure of one thing. What happened on Franklin Street wasn't an accident. It was a warning, a test, maybe even an attempted setup. But it failed. Monroe wasted no time. Within 48 hours of receiving the emails, he ordered an audit of every traffic stop made by Kirkland in the last 18 months. The results were damning. 73% of the individuals pulled over were black men. Over half had been charged with vague misdemeanors that never held up in court. Worse, the same racial profiling pattern appeared in the logs of 4 other officers, Miles, Drexler, Tolman, and Sloan. All of them worked overlapping shifts. All of them patrolled the same corridor near the developing district, where a multi-million-dollar real estate push had begun taking over low-income neighborhoods. Monroe suspected they weren't just abusing their authority. They were clearing the streets for profit. The deeper he dug, the dirtier it got. There were sealed records that required judicial clearance. Monroe had friends in federal offices who owed him favors, and he wasn't shy about calling them in. Surveillance footage from booking rooms had vanished, body cam footage mysteriously corrupted. But Monroe had come from internal affairs at the federal level. He'd handled corruption cases that made this look like child's play. He brought in his own tech forensics team under the radar. They recovered nearly all the footage, including Kirkland's missing body cam from the day of the arrest. What it showed was damning. Monroe calm, composed, asking for legal basis, and Kirkland violating every departmental protocol in the book. Still, he needed more. It wasn't enough to just expose Kirkland. If Monroe wanted to rip the roots out of Millstone's rot, he had to find the hand pulling the strings. That's when he went to visit Officer L. Sloan. Detective L. Sloan had been on medical leave for 3 weeks following a training injury. When Monroe showed up unannounced at Sloan's home in the suburbs, he found the officer hobbling around in a knee brace, beer in one hand, remote in the other. Sloan didn't seem surprised to see him. "Chief," he muttered, "was wondering how long it'd take you." "I'm not here for pleasantries," Monroe said. "You and Kirkland were exchanging coded emails. You knew I was coming before the mayor's office made it public. Who gave you that information?" Sloan sighed, leaned back in his recliner. "You're looking in the wrong place, sir." Monroe stepped closer. "Then point me in the right one." Sloan didn't speak for a while. His eyes wandered to a dusty photograph on the mantel, an old shot of the Millstone PD softball team. Monroe saw it too, a younger Sloan, a younger Voss, and a third man in the middle, older, tall, confident. "Who's that?" Monroe asked. Sloan chuckled. "That's the man who runs this city, Chief. Retired Deputy Commissioner Garrett Rourke. Been pulling strings long before you or I ever got a badge." Monroe narrowed his eyes. "He's not on payroll." "Doesn't need to be," Sloan said. "He built the machine. You're just oiling the gears now." That night, Monroe went back through old city records, police budgets, zoning contracts, and committee appointments. Garrett Rourke's name popped up in quiet ways, as a consultant, a community liaison, an advisor for Police Foundation grants. Monroe had seen this before, the shadow leadership. Rourke had stepped down officially, but he'd never really left. He'd just found other ways to keep the department under his control. Kirkland and his little group of officers were just a muscle for something bigger. Targeted policing to clear the path for gentrification, pressure tactics to force out tenants, arrest quotas to manipulate stats that fed state funding. And it all led back to Rourke. So Monroe did something unorthodox. He called a press conference, not for the public, but for the department. Closed doors, internal only. Every ranking officer in the precinct was required to attend. When they gathered in the briefing hall, they found Monroe already at the podium. Behind him were still images projected from Kirkland's body cam footage. Every officer in the room saw what Kirkland had done. Some looked away. Others stared, unmoving. Monroe didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his fist. He spoke slow, cold, precise. "What you're seeing is not just misconduct. It's corruption. It's betrayal. It's illegal. And it ends today. I am issuing suspension orders for Officers Kirkland, Miles, Drexler, and Tolman effective immediately. Internal Affairs will handle their investigations. However, if you are aware of any further involvement and you remain silent, you will fall with them. No more hiding behind the badge. No more immunity through silence." One officer, Sergeant Lena Farrow, stood and asked quietly, "What about Rourke?" Monroe's expression didn't change. "Rourke has a meeting scheduled with the state attorney tomorrow morning. He doesn't know it yet. But he will. The city's about to get a lot louder. The next day, Monroe walked straight into City Hall, documents in hand, escorted by 2 federal compliance officers. The mayor tried to intercept him, but Monroe pushed past. He wasn't there for permission. He was there for blood. He handed the full report to the state attorney. Inside were timestamps, transcripts, recovered footage, financial records linking Rourke to 2 major developers tied to city contracts. It was irrefutable. Rourke wasn't just guiding policy. He was making millions off the displacement of Black and immigrant communities, using the police department as his enforcers. News broke the next morning. The headline, "Millstone Police Chief Exposes Corruption Ring. Former Deputy Commissioner Implicated." The photo under it showed Monroe walking out of the courthouse, unshaken, surrounded by press. But the story didn't end there. That night, Monroe got into his car after another long shift. It was late, past 11. The streets were quiet. He started the engine. The dash flickered once, then returned to normal. As he pulled onto the road, a black SUV appeared behind him. No plates, no headlights, just creeping. He turned left. The SUV followed. He turned right. The SUV kept pace. Monroe's fingers tapped the wheel, calm, calculated. He drove toward the old station parking lot, circled once, then pulled into a dim alley behind a convenience store. He parked, waited. The SUV rolled in, slow. 2 men got out, both in dark suits, no badges, no words. Monroe stepped out, faced them. "If you're here to send a message," he said, "you've already lost." The taller man reached into his jacket. Monroe didn't flinch. But instead of a weapon, the man pulled out a sealed envelope. He handed it to Monroe, then turned and left without a word. The SUV disappeared into the night. Monroe opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No letterhead, just a sentence. "You've only cut the arm. The body remains." Monroe stared at the message, then slowly folded it. He slid it into his pocket, walked back to his car, and drove home in silence. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment overlooking the city, he poured a glass of bourbon and reviewed the entire case file again. He didn't know who had sent the note, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done, because someone out there still believed they were untouchable. And Chief Elias Monroe had just become the most dangerous man in Millstone. He knew the system now. He had its map, its cracks, its players, and if they wanted war, he would give them hell.